Hello, everyone. I'm Ella Karev. I'm a PhD candidate in Egyptology here at the University of Chicago. I'm happy to welcome you to the third session of our remote ancient languages workshop. So today I'll be talking about Greek and its widespread use in Egypt from the 6th century BC and well into the Muslim conquest, but focusing mostly on the Greco-Roman period. If you attended Foy Scalf's lecture on Egyptian languages, then these goals will be somewhat familiar. Today's seminar will focus on an overview of Greek language and writing, but no actual language learning. The next 25 minutes or so will look at the use of Greek, how did it arrive and when, and the implications of that on Egyptology. Again, if you've watched Foy's talk about Egyptian languages, then you may remember the linguistic tree of languages in which Egyptian belonged to the Afro-Asiatic language family, including Berber and Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew, but separated into its own branch of the Afro-Asiatic family tree. In a similar way, Greek is an independent branch of the Indo-European family of languages, and that language family includes Germanic, like German and English, and Latin branches like Spanish and French, etc. Throughout its long history, Greek used the Greek alphabet, but there were also other systems like Linear B and the Cypriot syllabary. Before the Greek alphabet was used to write down the Greek language, there was Linear B. Linear B is unrelated to the Greek alphabet and was in use for the earliest attested use of the Greek language, Mycenaean Greek, from the 16th to 12th centuries BC. Another similar system used to write the Greek language was the Cypriot syllabary, which is closely related to Linear B but uses somewhat different syllabic conventions to represent different phoneme sequences. The Cypriot syllabary is attested in Cyprus from the 11th century BC until its gradual abandonment in the late classical period in favor of the standard Greek alphabet. The earliest form of the Greek alphabet as we know it emerged in the 9th century BC, but then we have a period in Greek history known as the Dark Ages, during which there were no texts. After the Dark Ages, we start to see texts written in archaic versions of the Greek alphabet as we know it. The Greek alphabet was pretty unique, as it was the first language to have letters for vowels as well as consonants, and therefore formed the basis of the Latin and Cyrillic scripts. Latin script, same as the one we use today for English. The Greek alphabet is derived from Phoenician, which was used to write a Semitic language. Like Hebrew and Arabic, the Phoenician alphabet contained no dedicated letters for vowels. In archaic and early classical times, the Greek alphabet varied across regions in shapes, sound values, and even writing direction, sometimes right to left like a Semitic language, sometimes left to right like a Latin language and English, and occasionally one line this way and one line another way. Well before the classical period of Greece, the left-right writing direction and the letter shapes were standardized and established. Like the Latin alphabets, Greek originally only had capital or majuscule letters with no distinction between upper and lower case. But eventually, more cursive writing styles emerged, for example, for writing on papyrus. The merging of the more cursive handwriting and the capital letters used for inscriptions eventually led to the use of an upper and lower case. So when you look at a published ancient Greek text, or even modern Greek texts before the spelling reforms of the 80s, you'll see diacritics, which are essentially little marks developed around the 3rd century BC above the letters. Originally, Greek was a polytonic language, that is to say a pitch language like modern Chinese, and different markers were developed to indicate tonality. But by late antiquity, this pitch had been pretty much lost, and instead the language became accented like English is today. So when we teach ancient Greek in the classroom or learn modern Greek, it's an accent like you would learn in French or Spanish. In addition to these accent markers, Greek also has 2 breathing marks, which indicate if the initial vowel carries a rough breathing, which is like ha or he, or a smooth breathing like a or e. Hercules in Greek starts with an eta and a rough breathing. That's why we pronounce it Hercules, or at least in English. The texts themselves did not contain these diacritics until pretty late, and well into the Byzantine period. Okay, so now we understand a little bit about the development of the written language, but what about the spoken language? What was this alphabet used for? So there's really very little evidence about the origins of Greek, though there are several different theories. I won't go too deep into it because it's not so relevant to the use of Greek in Egypt, but I will discuss the dialects that ended up developing in Greece and the surrounding area. In the archaic and classical periods, there were 3 main dialects of the Greek language and a lot of other little ones. The main ones were Aeolic, Ionic, and Doric. The names corresponded to the 3 historical tribes of the Greeks. Of these, Ionic is probably one of the most recognizable since it was the language of Homer and the basis for the Attic dialect, the language of Athens. If you've ever taken an introductory Greek course or even thought about it, your textbook probably has been titled Attic Greek. Attic was a subdialect of Ionic and became the language of Athens, and therefore the language in which we have a lot of classical material. It's also the dialect that formed the basis for medieval and modern Greek. A sidebar to talk about the important element of the Greek language, inflection. So Greek is an inflected language. That means that the form of a noun changes according to its grammatical function. English has largely lost this characteristic, but it lives on in the object form of certain pronouns. So, for example, you wouldn't say I asked he, but rather I asked him, because him is an object. In the same way, you wouldn't say him asked me or he asked I, because he and I change according to whether they're serving as an object or subject. Greek has exactly the same thing, but for 5 cases. Nominative, which is the subject, genitive, which is belonging to, accusative, which is the object, dative, the indirect object, and vocative, like when you're talking to someone, O Zeus, for example. This also means that the order of words in Greek can change dramatically, since word order isn't what determines grammatical function. You can say, for instance, the apple to him gave I, and it wouldn't be any stranger than I gave the apple to him. As an example, this is the first line of the Iliad in Greek and in English translation, with colors corresponding to the different elements, so you can see that the word order is entirely different. From the Egyptian perspective, our interest lies in a form of Greek most commonly known as koine or koine, though it also goes by the name of Alexandrian Greek, Common Attic, Hellenistic Greek, and New Testament Greek. The name koine means common, as it was the lingua franca throughout the empire of Alexander the Great and the subsequent empires that came from it, like the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. More on that in a bit. Koine changed Attic Greek. The pitch accent system I talked about earlier pretty much disappeared. Vowel length was more or less homogenized, and some diphthongs found themselves turned into monophthongs. And if that sounds like gibberish to you, this just means that diphthongs like A were pronounced like E, or I pronounced more like A. Koine was spoken and written in Egypt, but how did it get there? So the Greeks have been in Egypt since pretty early on. Herodotus sometimes can be a shady source of information, but at the very least, he maintains that a garrison of Ionian Greek mercenaries was established at Daphne, a site which is pretty much now on the Suez Canal. After the Greek Dark Ages, the city of Naucratis on the Canopic branch of the Nile was founded. It was a permanent Greek colony and formed a commercial link with the rest of the world, and still maintained traditional Greek elements like temples to Hera and Apollo. However, Egypt at the time was ruled by Saites and Persians, so Greek was not yet in widespread use and definitely not the administrative language of the country. That would come with Alexander. So Alexander the Great conquered Egypt early on in his world tour in 332 BC. He respected Egyptian culture and was crowned as pharaoh. He also established the city of Alexandria, named after himself, and went on to conquer the rest of the world. When he died unexpectedly in 323 BC, his great empire was split amongst his generals, with Egypt handed over to his general Ptolemy, who would go on to found the Ptolemaic dynasty after some struggle I won't go into. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Greek. People outside the field are always surprised to find out that Cleopatra, arguably one of the most famous Egyptian queens, was a Greek by birth. Notably, she was probably the only ruler to learn Egyptian. The rest of them spoke only Greek. As a result, the language of the elite population of Egypt was Greek. This was further encouraged by the development of Alexandria as a cultural hub. The famous museum and library conducted their business in Greek. By the 2nd century BC, Greek was the lingua franca of Egypt and certainly the higher register of language use, as well as the administrative language of the country. Some time should be dedicated to one of the most famous texts written in Alexandria, the Septuagint, the earliest extant Koine Greek translation of books from the Hebrew Bible. Septuagint means 70 in Latin, based on a story from the letter of Aristeas. According to the story, Ptolemy II ordered 70 Jewish scholars, 6 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, to translate the Hebrew Bible independently, but by divine inspiration, they produced identical translations. The considerable Jewish community of Alexandria used the Septuagint as equal to the Hebrew text, but it was pretty much abandoned by the 2nd century AD. However, the Septuagint served as an important source for the earliest Christians who could not read Hebrew. Thus, the writing of a Koine Greek text in Egypt served as the basis for the text of the early Christian church. Since Greek was both the language most widely used and the language of the royalty and the elite and the administration, it's very natural that bilingualism developed along with a practice of double naming. Bearers of bilingual Greek-Egyptian names strongly increased in the 2nd century, and a large population of these individuals were in the military or the administration. Some people perhaps took on a Greek name for professional reasons only, while others may truly have felt an affinity with both ways of life. The administration, which was in Greek, started having full translations of Egyptian documents into Greek, or at the very least, Greek dockets describing the contents of the text, for example here. It's clear that Greek became an inseparable part of life in Egypt, and not knowing Greek was a reason to be treated poorly even. In this letter from an Egyptian subordinate to his boss Zenon, the subordinate begs to be paid, saying that his managers have failed to pay him while Zenon is away. But they have treated me with scorn because I am barbarian. I beg you, therefore, if it is just to you, to order them that I am to obtain what is owing, and that in the future they pay me in full, so that I may not perish of hunger because I do not know how to be Greek. It's unclear if to be Greek means actually speaking the language or acting a certain way, or perhaps both, but in either case, not knowing how to do so, even this early on in the 3rd century, did not bode well for you. The letter is, however, written in Greek, so that also suggests that there were translators and scribes who spoke both languages well enough to produce a good translation. Bilingualism existed at the highest levels of society. Ptolemy III was the first ruler to start a tradition of contracts orchestrated with the Egyptian priests, published throughout the country as bilingual inscriptions written in 3 scripts: Demotic, Greek, and hieroglyphs. His stone stele is the Canopus decree of 238 BC. Other well-known examples include the Memphis decree, i.e. the Rosetta Stone, erected by Ptolemy V, his grandson, in 196 BC. It's the Rosetta Stone which allowed Egyptian hieroglyphs to be deciphered. To understand how Greek survived into 1822, we need to jump back into the history of the Greek language just for a little bit. The Roman Empire conquered the Greek provinces in 146 BC, but maintained the usage of Greek as a lingua franca throughout the empire. When Rome split into the Eastern and Western empires in 395 AD, the Byzantine Empire, aka the Eastern Empire, maintained Greek as a liturgical and official language. The use of Greek in Byzantium was maintained until the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, which is conventionally dated to the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. After that, regions conquered by the Byzantine Empire, like the Balkans, largely reverted to their native languages, and the features of modern Greek became more defined. What this means is that ancient Greek texts have been copied over and over and preserved many times in the archives of the Byzantine Empire. By the early 19th century, when Champollion deciphered the Rosetta Stone, ancient Greek was a fundamental part of a proper gentlemanly education. So when Ptolemy V commissioned the Rosetta Stone in the official, common, and priestly languages of Egypt, I doubt he saw this coming. In 1802, the first translation of the Greek text, the Rosetta Stone, was written shortly after it was discovered in 1799. Thomas Young, the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society of London, and Jean-Francois Champollion, a teacher, began corresponding about the cartouches, frames around names, that could potentially contain Greek names in hieroglyphic letters. They were able to identify Cleopatra and Ptolemy, and later paved the way for the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Demotic script. The use of Greek in Egypt also heavily influenced the final stage of the Egyptian language and one in use today as a liturgical language, Coptic. Coptic began as a transcription of Egyptian words into Greek letters. Egyptian, unlike Greek, did not have vowels, and pronunciation of the Demotic had changed, so naturally scribes added glosses meant to provide the correct pronunciation of certain terms. Foy already brought this up in his talk, but nevertheless, I do want to bring up an example of Egyptians experimenting with writing their language in Greek, and then Coptic was kind of a natural development. Here we have an old Coptic gloss on a Demotic magical text in which it tells in Greek letters the reader to read Abraham, in one of the spells. Eventually, Coptic became a language in its own right and superseded Demotic, the common Egyptian language, up until the 2nd century BC, give or take. It consisted of a Greek alphabet with the addition of Demotic characters to portray sounds that didn't exist in Greek, like j. Greek and Coptic more or less coexisted as official languages until the Muslim conquest, and even after the conquest, there were many bilingual Greek-Arabic documents well into the 10th century AD. Coptic is now used as the liturgical language of the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria. As much as 20% of Coptic vocabulary is Greek, probably influenced by the sheer amount of liturgical texts in both languages. Egypt is an important source for classicists as much as Egyptologists because of the huge amount of papyrological material in Greek coming from Egypt, both literary and documentary. From the early 19th to about the mid-20th century, papyri were ruthlessly dug up and acquired as part of large collections that included also highly valued antiquities. These acquisitions increased when Sabah diggers in the Fayum discovered thousands of papyri, which were then sold off in lots. A turning point in papyrology, or the study of papyri, came in the year 1891. John Mahaffey published the first volume of the papyri dug up by William Flinders Petrie in the Fayum in the late 1880s. Shortly thereafter, the Berlin Museum commissioned and published the first official facsimiles of their collection of Greek documentary papyri. A few years later, in 1896, the word papyrologist was used, first in French and then in English. At first, papyrology denoted specifically the decipherment and presentation of texts written on papyri in Greek. Texts in the Egyptian languages, in whatever script, hieroglyphic, hieratic, Demotic, and Coptic, remained in the preserve of the field that came to be called Egyptology. Another great boost to the field came with Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt, who in the late 1890s excavated Oxyrhynchus, especially its garbage dumps. That's where you find the best stuff. These excavations, after 6 seasons of digging, were the source of the world's largest collection of papyri. Almost as impressive as the finds was the fact that in under a year of the arrival of papyri in England, Grenfell and Hunt actually published all 158 texts. Anyone who's published a text knows that this is insane. In a revolutionary move, they actually provided translations, setting the format for all papyrological publications in the future. German papyrologists, perhaps unsurprisingly, contributed to the organization of the discipline. Ulfried Wilken monumentally assessed documentary papyri published up until then, 1912, and published 4 volumes that are still useful today. Papyrological schools sprang up in the 1920s and 30s along with their respective congresses and have now grown to be complete institutes like the Papyrological Institute at Leiden and the Institute of the Papyrology at the Sorbonne. They are by no means limited to Greek, but they certainly have a lot of Greek papyrological texts. The Greek papyri from Egypt can include objects as mundane as a mummifier's report on a dead body and as highbrow as Homer, both of which we have here at the OI. If you're interested in learning Greek specifically for reading papyri, bypassing the fairly grueling years of studying Attic Greek and reading Demosthenes, I'll be teaching an 8-week course this summer through the Oriental Institute's continuing education program. We'll learn the basics of the Greek language and even read some of the papyri presented in this talk. I'll be happy to see you there, and thank you for listening.
For over 100 years, the OI has been a leading research center for the study of ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. Join us in uncovering the past and learn about the beginnings of our lives as humans together. Become a member by visiting oi.uchicago.edu/member.